What if you were just 3 minutes late to court? Do you think the entire courtroom would humiliate you, even if you were a top federal prosecutor? In Elmridge, that didn't just happen. It sparked an earthquake when an old case, a wrongfully convicted teenager, and a recording buried for 6 years, suddenly resurfaced. But why was Elias Whitaker, the man who once took down entire crime syndicates, standing silently, head bowed, in that courtroom that day? And more importantly, who was the real killer? You're watching a true story that shook the entire justice system. Hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe, because the next truth, you won't be able to look away. Elias Whitaker, a seasoned federal prosecutor who had helped overturn dozens of wrongful convictions, only intended to stop by the Elmridge County Courthouse that day to file an appeal for a ridiculous parking ticket. But he was late by exactly 3 minutes. Just 3 minutes. And the entire courtroom seemed to freeze as Judge Jasper Holloway slammed his gavel down and fined Elias $750, calling him a disgrace to the justice system. Murmurs, a few scoffs from the back row, laughter that stung. Elias didn't argue. He didn't speak. He just stood there, not looking at the judge, but staring through the room to a teenager sitting quietly in the back. The boy wore a faded hoodie, in his hands a crumpled piece of foil with the name Marcus Delaney scribbled across it, a name buried under layers of forgotten justice 6 years ago. Elias wasn't there for himself. He was there for Marcus. 6 years ago, Marcus, just 17, was convicted of murder. No witnesses, no weapon, no motive. His mother, Aurora Bennett, cried through the entire trial and died 3 months later, carrying her unanswered pleas to the grave. Elias had ignored the case back then. Too busy. No one asked him to do more. He believed the system would fix itself. But today, when that very system humiliated him in front of strangers, he finally saw the truth. He had been wrong. That same night, Elias returned to his office, alone, dusting off old case files no one had touched in years. In his hands wasn't just a stack of criminal records, but a question that refused to die. Who buried Marcus? And why? He stayed up all night. And then, one page fell out, a handwritten letter from a mother long gone, and a recording no one had ever heard, revealing Marcus's statement had been twisted right inside Southfield Station, a place where defense attorneys weren't allowed to step in. Everything Elias once believed in had just collapsed. Judge Dorian Steele, once praised as the face of legal discipline, didn't need to slam his gavel that day. He simply leaned forward, looked Elias dead in the eye with an icy stare, and declared before the entire courtroom, "Men like you have no right to uphold the law when you clearly think you're above it." The room erupted in a wave of laughter, a strange mix of pity and mockery. Elias Whitaker, the same prosecutor who once won the National Award for Justice Advocacy, now stood there like a criminal, all because he was 3 minutes late. But he didn't respond, because he knew there was a truth waiting behind those dusty files, one far more painful than any public humiliation. That night, Elias returned to his office. He shoved the clutter off his desk and reopened an old case file. Marcus Delaney, the 17-year-old black teen convicted of murder, in a case with no witness, no weapon, and no clear motive. Back then, Elias had only served as a consulting advisor on the case, and he had stayed silent. Silent, just like the whole town had turned away from the desperate cries of Marcus's mother, Aurora Bennett. She died 90 days after the trial, in a broken-down apartment, leaving behind only a letter that no one had ever read. Inside the file, Elias found a name that had been crossed out in red ink: Felix Radcliffe, a homeless man, a witness no one wanted to believe, because he had no legal credibility. But that discarded testimony led Elias to a hidden audio recording, secretly made during Marcus's interrogation at Southfield Station. No lawyer, no guardian, just questions, sharp, relentless, digging into a frightened boy's fear, and a confession, not spoken by Marcus himself, but stitched together from a manipulated recording. Elias froze. he realized he had been complicit in that silence. In the middle of the night, he drove to Felix's last known address, a homeless shelter tucked away in Gray Hill Haven. The old security guard hesitated, then handed him an envelope. He left this behind, said if anyone ever came looking who believed the boy was innocent, give it to them. Elias's hands trembled. Inside was a copy of the original testimony, redacted, scribbled over in red pen, and the full unedited audio recording. That night, Elias didn't sleep, because for the first time in years, the reflection in his mirror wasn't his own. It was Marcus, wrists in cuffs, eyes wet with tears, asking one thing: "Do you believe me now?" No one in that courtroom knew that Elias Whitaker, the man being fined for arriving late, was once the reason 3 mayors resigned over corruption scandals. But today, he was just a lone figure, standing in a room where justice had been twisted by prejudice and power. With that file in hand, Elias quietly launched his own unofficial investigation. The first shock came from a forgotten audio tape buried deep in the Southfield Station archives. The original recording from Marcus Delaney's interrogation 6 years ago. On that tape, you could hear the inspector pressuring a 17-year-old to confess. No lawyer, no guardian, no transcript, just shaky breathing and a trembling voice saying, I just want to go home." The second shock came when Elias publicly launched Justice Ember, a campaign to reopen 12 cases showing signs of legal bias. But within 48 hours, he was suspended from duty, accused of unilateral actions that destabilized the judicial system. That same day, an anonymous letter made its way to local media, claiming Elias was just seeking revenge, trying to look noble. And just like that, everything he had built in his career collapsed overnight. They found him sitting alone on the courthouse bench for 3 hours, silent, until a young black woman approached, holding out a worn piece of paper. "I found this in my mom's room. Her name was Aurora Bennett." It was the original letter, never opened. At the bottom, the last line, scribbled in faded ink, read, "Please listen to my son. He's just a child." The final reckoning came during an emergency hearing, one Elias himself had requested. But this time, he wasn't seated at the prosecutor's table. He stood on the witness stand. Facing him, Judge Dorian Steele and the full Judicial Ethics Council. Elias played the tape. He read aloud the testimony of Felix Radcliffe. The witness no one believed because he was poor, because he was homeless, because he was deemed legally worthless. And then he ended with a question that froze the entire room. When a human life is discarded for not being legally credible, what's left to call justice in Elmridge? Buried beneath a case the world had nearly forgotten was a black teenager named Marcus Delaney, only 17 years old, yet sentenced as if he were a hardened killer. No witnesses, no fingerprints, just a forced confession, and the rest finished by prejudice. After the explosive hearing, Elias didn't return to his office. Instead, he held a press conference right on the steps of Elmridge's City Hall, revealing 7 years of legal misconduct, backed by documented evidence. The list wasn't just about Marcus. It exposed 11 other cases. Ordinary people, wrongfully convicted, no lawyers, no chance to speak, no justice. The system cracked. News outlets launched full-scale investigations. TV stations aired nonstop for 72 hours. And the people started asking, how many children were silenced? The mayor of Elmridge had no choice but to authorize a full-scale investigation. 3 judges were suspended, 4 prosecutors summoned before the Federal Ethics Committee, and Marcus, after 6 long years locked up like a criminal, was finally released. He walked out of the iron gates of Elmridge Juvenile Center. There was no cheering crowd, only one man waiting, Elias in a faded shirt, holding an old notebook. Marcus paused, unsure, but Elias simply said, "I can't give you back your youth, but I will give you back the truth." Marcus stepped forward. No hug, no words, just a nod. But in that moment, every wound, every tear, every ounce of anger was quietly answered by something more powerful than justice: presence. And then Elias disappeared from the city. No one knew where he went, until weeks later, a short video surfaced online, posted by a law student. It showed Elias teaching for free at a small community center in another state. No titles, no applause, just a teacher, a single light, and a whiteboard. Marcus Delaney, a victim of a biased justice system, had once been convicted by an all-white jury, represented by a court-appointed attorney who barely said more than 3 words. We accept that. For 6 years, he lived in silence, where every clang of a prison door felt like the end of a youth that never got to begin. His mother, Aurora, passed away carrying that injustice with her. The last thing she left behind was a voice message that no one ever heard. Now Marcus stands alone at Oakmere Cemetery. The wind rustles softly through the rows of cypress trees. No cameras, no speeches, no one beside him, just him and a handwritten letter. At the bottom, the final words penned by Elias before vanishing from town. Marcus, I didn't save you when you needed me most. But today I choose to stand with the truth. Late, but not silent. Your mother's son has seen the light. Marcus folds the letter and lays it gently on his mother's grave. His eyes glisten, not from anger, but from the quiet ache of finally being seen. For the first time, someone had named his pain, with nothing but truth. He walks away, never looking back. But every step echoes like a living testimony, against a system that once turned its back, and now can no longer stay silent. No music, no applause, just the sound of wind drifting past weathered headstones, whispering to those who never got to speak. Justice came late, but this time, it came. Marcus's mother, Aurora Bennett, had once worked as a nurse in the Elmridge ER. She wasn't a lawyer. She didn't know how to file appeals or quote legal codes. But she knew one thing, without question: her son was not a murderer. And for that belief, she knocked on every door, from the chief judge's chambers to the mayor's office. She submitted petitions every month, wrote handwritten letters to 17 human rights organizations, only to be met with silence or cold copy-paste replies. Insufficient grounds for review. Aurora never gave up. But some battles aren't lost because you're weak. They're lost because you're alone. 3 days before Marcus's case was finally reopened, she collapsed at her kitchen table in a rundown apartment she rented in the Eastway district. That apartment, Elias would later learn, had its power cut off because she had spent her entire pension hiring a private investigator. She never told anyone. Aurora died from a stroke, not from illness, but from sheer exhaustion. When Elias heard the news, he sat frozen in his car for hours, parked in front of the courthouse, the same place where Aurora had once stood in the rain, clutching a wrinkled case file, begging for just one hearing to save her son. I don't need people to believe me, she once told Elias. I just need one person willing to listen. And now, Elias is the last one left listening, and he can't pretend not to hear anymore. Elias returned to the old law library in the Renfall Judicial District, a forgotten archive where dusty files of discarded cases sat untouched. No one came here anymore, except those who still believed that justice sometimes lived between yellowing pages. He sat alone in the cold room, the dim yellow light casting long shadows across an open case file. His fingers stopped on a single page, one that had been stapled outside the official documents. A handwritten statement from a teenager named Felix Radcliffe, filed just hours after the crime. The boy claimed he saw 2 other men leaving the scene, a detail that had never appeared in any official transcript. Elias froze. He double-checked the file number, verified the seal, and felt his chest tighten. That statement had never been submitted to the jury. Worse, it had been taken by an investigator who was later fired for evidence tampering. Felix, the only eyewitness who might have saved Marcus, had been labeled unreliable. Because he once lived in a shelter, the system had erased him before he ever got the chance to speak. Elias closed his eyes, and in the dark, Aurora's face returned. The mother who died before her son ever got to hear even a single buried truth. If she were still alive, Elias thought, she wouldn't forgive me for ignoring this. Not one more day. And that was the moment he made up his mind. He would find Felix, even if the whole town had already forgotten he existed. Felix Radcliffe, a name long pushed to the margins of society, was now just a thin shadow of a man living beneath the awning of Eastmoor Station. Ilias found him on a cold, gray afternoon as a light rain fell, like the sky itself trying to wash away something everyone else had forgotten. Felix didn't look Elias in the eye. He simply asked in a low voice, "You here for that kid? The one they locked up instead of the real killer?" Elias didn't speak. He just nodded. And then Felix began to tell the story, his voice catching in places like it had to climb over years of being ignored. That night, he was hiding behind an abandoned newspaper stand, trying to avoid a group of teens who liked to steal from him. He saw two men run from the scene. One had long hair, arms covered in tattoos. He tossed something, a knife, before disappearing into the dark. The cops arrived. They never asked Felix a single question. They just arrested Marcus for being near the body. "I told one officer," Felix said quietly, "but he told me to keep quiet or I'd be kicked off the station platform again." From his worn backpack, Felix pulled out a notebook, its edges yellowed, pages weathered by time. He had written everything he'd witnessed. Even though people called him crazy, even though he wandered the streets, Felix had held on to the truth, because as he put it, in case one day, someone actually wanted to hear it. Elias stood there, frozen, holding that notebook with both hands, as if he were cradling what was left of a justice system that had shattered. Neither of them spoke, only the sound of a train rumbling past, underlining the years that had slipped by while the truth sat in silence. And in that moment, Elias understood. It wasn't just Marcus who'd been buried. Felix had been too, by the same system. But Felix's testimony was never considered. In the Marcus Delaney case file, a red ink note stood out like a scar. Unreliable witness, homeless, history of addiction. And just like that, the truth was thrown in the trash. Elias stared at those words in the data vault of Elmridge Courthouse, the very place that once called him the right hand of justice. Now that same place crushed anyone brave enough to speak the truth. Felix had gone through rehab. He'd fallen hard, but for the past 6 years, he'd tried to live clean. Not for redemption, but for the hope that one day someone would believe what he saw. "I don't need an apology," Felix said quietly. "I just want that boy not to pay for what a killer did." Elias left the Renfall District Archive with two things: Felix's handwritten notebook and a trembling but clear audio recording, his voice recounting every detail. When Elias filed a petition to reopen the case with the Federal Review Board, their response was a single line: "Request denied. Insufficient grounds. Witness lacks credibility." And in that moment, Elias understood. He wasn't just facing a flawed case. He was up against an entire system, one that didn't care who was right or wrong, only who could stay silent longer. That night, Elias Whitaker submitted a leave of absence, without pay. And the very next morning, he held a press conference. He announced the launch of Justice Ember, a campaign to reopen 12 forgotten cases. He revealed 7 years of prosecutorial misconduct. He exposed the rot buried under procedure, sealed behind closed doors. Elmridge shook, and Elias knew he was about to pay the price. Elias couldn't stay silent. He was no longer the prosecutor of Elmridge, but he was the only man in the system who had looked Marcus in the eyes and believed him. Late at night, in a small apartment on Windermere Street, Elias sat alone, combing through case files long since closed. No assistance, no legal protection, just anger and a belief that a boy like Marcus wasn't the only one. Quietly, he launched Justice Ember, a reinvestigation into 12 cases showing signs of bias over the last 7 years, all tied to the Sterling Vale Courthouse. Once called by the press the crematorium of hope for the poor and people of color. And when Elias published the first list, naming 3 judges and 4 prosecutors involved in coerced confessions, evidence tampering, and case suppression, the media storm hit like a wave. Elmridge woke up. People started sharing. Old victims spoke out. And behind closed doors at City Hall, an emergency meeting began. By morning, Elias was officially suspended. A notice was taped to his office door. Position terminated due to overreach of authority, damaging the credibility of the Elmridge legal system. No one stood by him, no media coverage. Just one folded note slipped beneath his front door. I'm the mother of Daryl. Thank you for doing what no one else dared to do. Elias folded the note and placed it in his wallet, right next to the photo of his son, who died 10 years earlier, after being wrongfully arrested. He knew what this would cost him, and still he chose to keep going. Elias was suspended, not because he was wrong, but because he had touched something Elmridge had kept buried beneath the floorboards for nearly a decade. On Monday morning, he found the notice sitting on his desk. Temporary suspension, pending internal review for overstepping authority and compromising the image of the judicial system. No phone call, no questions, no one checking in. Only the ticking of an old wooden clock, a gift his son had made at summer camp before he died, because of a mistake made by this very system. Elias stood alone in his empty office, staring at sealed case files. On the wall, a framed photo from the day he was sworn in, smiling beside Judge Steele, now hung like a cruel joke. But he knew the real reason. The Marcus Delaney case wasn't just a mistake. It was a key, one that unlocked a chain of rot, threaded through the system. He had uncovered a letter Aurora had written just 2 weeks before she died, a desperate plea to 3 legal agencies, all of which had returned it with the same red scrawl. Case closed. No further review. Felix Radcliffe, the only living witness, was never called to testify because he was homeless, because he had a history of addiction, because he was labeled inadmissible. Elias had reached his breaking point. He filed for an emergency hearing and signed a legal waiver, forfeiting all personal protection. I'll stand alone, he wrote, but this time I'll speak. There was no anger in his eyes now, only calm, the kind that belongs to someone with nothing left to lose. Because some trials aren't about winning, they're about finally letting the truth be heard. But Elias didn't stop, not after coming this far, not after seeing Aurora's face in that final letter, and absolutely not after rereading Marcus's interrogation transcript. No lawyer, no guardian, and 6 straight hours of questioning when he was just 17. Elias walked straight into the High Ridge Judicial Oversight Council, carrying more than 140 pages of marked documents, proof that Marcus's confession had been coerced through threats and psychological manipulation. In the sealed hearing room, light from the tall windows cut across Elias's face, but he didn't read from the file. He simply spoke. I used to think the law was what kept us alive, he said. I was wrong. It's the truth, even when it doesn't have a seat in the courtroom. Elias recounted everything. How the investigators stripped Marcus of his right to remain silent. How Judge Steele ignored Aurora's final petition. Just 4 days before she collapsed, the room stayed silent. Then, one council member, gray-haired, quiet, stood up and slid a file across the table toward Elias. A case file never made public. Inside was a recording, a statement from the discarded witness, Felix, describing exactly who fled the crime scene. No one had ever opened it until today. Elias nodded and placed his hand on the folder. We don't need another judge, he said softly. We need one more witness who's finally heard. And just like that, the door to the emergency hearing opened, not because he shouted, but because he was done being silent. Everything changed because of one recording, a single dot-wave audio file pulled from a rusted hard drive at Southfield Station, Interrogation Room 3, capturing the exact moment the law abandoned a 17-year-old boy. In the recording, there's the screech of a metal chair, Marcus's quick, anxious breathing, and then a man's voice, low and heavy, fills the room. You want to get out of here? Then sign this. Or wait while we follow protocol. A few days, a few weeks, maybe longer. No lawyer, no mother, not a single adult to stop it. Elias listened to that recording alone, late at night, inside the dust-covered archive room of High Ridge, a place no one visited anymore. And when Marcus's voice cracked near the end, I didn't do it. Elias simply switched off the light and sat in the dark for a long time. The next morning, he stepped into the public hearing. In his hand, a small USB drive. Across the room, Judge Dorian Steele, the man who had rejected every clemency request for 6 straight years. "You said that boy received a fair trial," Elias said, his voice steady. "Then listen. Listen to the truth you buried." He hit play. The room fell silent. Steele gripped the arms of his chair. A few council members stood up, faces pale. Reporters rushed out, calling their editors. "This isn't just a recording," Elias said. "This is a cry for help no one ever heard." And then, from the back of the room, a voice spoke. "We failed him." For the first time, Southfield Station was no longer where a wrongful conviction began. It was where a reckoning started. In the emergency hearing at the Eldonmore Supreme Court, the air felt thick, compressed, like truth itself was holding its breath. Elias Whitaker no longer wore a prosecutor's badge on his chest, but his voice still carried the weight of a man who had once stood between justice and the void. Across from him sat Judge Dorian Steele, the man who once humiliated him in public. But Elias hadn't come to reclaim dignity. He came to expose the truth. One by one, he laid out pages of case files beneath a wall of television cameras. And then, a raw, unedited recording filled the room. A police officer's voice shouting, threatening, inside Interrogation Room 3 at Southfield Station. No lawyer, no guardian. Marcus, not yet 18, had been coerced into confessing to a crime he didn't commit. Ellis didn't accuse Steele outright. He used questions, each one sharp, deliberate, surgical. Why was a witness statement labeled unreliable without anyone reviewing the content? Who signed off on an interrogation with no legal representative present? And finally, can you look Marcus in the eyes when he walks out of that prison? Steele said nothing, not because he didn't know the answers, but because every answer pointed back at him. In the gallery below, a young black boy, the brother of someone wrongly convicted years ago, clutched his mother's hand. And for the first time, they didn't see helplessness in each other's eyes. They saw what Elias had sparked, a sliver of light, just enough to illuminate 7 years of darkness that Elmridge had quietly built. And from that moment forward, no one questioned it again. Justice had finally walked through the right door. Right after the hearing, a list of 12 cases showing signs of misconduct was broadcast live on national television. Black and white text scrolled across screens, slicing into dinner tables across millions of homes. And in Hawthorne Bridge, the town once proud to be where justice sleeps in peace, outrage erupted. People poured into the streets, not because they hadn't suspected it, but because for the first time they had proof. On the front page of the morning paper, a photo of Elias, clutching a thick case file, eyes sunken from sleepless nights, standing outside the courthouse like a quiet symbol of a truth that could no longer be ignored. Clarice, a mother whose son had once been wrongfully convicted of petty theft, broke down in tears when she heard his name on the list. A father who had sold his home to hire a defense attorney whispered through choked sobs, "If only I had known this sooner." Elias declined every interview, turned down every award. He stood only once, at the podium outside Elmridge City Hall, and said a single line, "I didn't do this because I had permission. I did it because silence was no longer an option." That night outside the very courthouse where so many wrongful verdicts had been buried, someone planted a wooden sign in the grass. No one is disposable when they carry the truth. The wind passed through not with bitterness, but with something gentler, like a whisper carried across time. This time, the light didn't just shine on one man. It reached an entire generation. Under mounting pressure from the public and a nationwide media storm, Mayor Rowan Beckett, who had remained silent throughout the growing controversy, finally stepped forward. In an emergency press conference held at Elmridge City Hall, he announced an unprecedented decision, a full-scale independent investigation across the entire district, in the immediate suspension of 3 judges and 4 prosecutors named in Elias's report. There was no applause, no cheers, only a heavy silence, as if the entire town was swallowing a truth they'd long suspected, but never dared to face. That same afternoon, one of the judges left the courthouse with his head bowed low. The townspeople didn't shout. They simply stood on either side of the street holding handwritten signs, "No one is above the law." Justice came late, but it came. Elias didn't attend. He was home, in his old kitchen, making tea for his retired wife. When a reporter knocked on his door, he answered with only one quiet sentence. "I don't need to be thanked. I just need Marcus to come home with clean hands." And in a small apartment elsewhere in town, Marcus, still fumbling his way through freedom, stood before a modest altar holding a photo of his mother. He opened the letter Elias had written him and read it aloud one last time. "Justice isn't a spotlight that shines on heroes. It's a flame, kept alive by those who refuse to let go." Outside his window, the evening wind passed gently through the trees. Elmridge was no longer silent. After 6 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, Marcus Delaney, no longer the 17-year-old boy he once was, stepped through the iron gates of Red Hollow Juvenile Detention Center. The sky above was gray. No one waited for him, just a thin jacket and a wrinkled letter Elias had once sent through a public defender. He didn't cry, but his eyes, the same ones that had watched his mother be turned away outside the courthouse, no longer burned with rage. They held only silence. A reporter pushed forward and asked, "Do you have anything to say, Marcus?" He turned slowly and replied, "I just hope no one else has to walk out of this place like I did, carrying a scar named silence." Elsewhere in a quiet corner of Hawthorne Bridge, Elias sat in his car, case file in hand. He hadn't come to pick Marcus up, because he wasn't a hero. He was just a man keeping a promise. But when he looked into the rearview mirror and saw Marcus standing alone in that courtyard, he quietly opened the door and stepped out. No cameras, no journalists, just two people, one who had been stripped of freedom and another who had nearly let go of justice, meeting again in wordless recognition. Elias placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. He didn't need to speak. That touch said more than all the apologies society never gave him. And just then, a light rain began to fall. Not harsh, not angry, but as if the sky itself was gently washing away the years of injustice. Marcus looked up, then walked forward. Free, but no longer alone. Elias Whitaker was reinstated. The headlines ran across every morning paper, accompanied by a photo of him stepping out of the Elmridge courthouse, a soft smile on his face and hair grayer than before. But when invited to speak at the honorary ceremony, Elias stood silent. He didn't take the plaque Mayor Rowan Beckett held out. He looked around the hall, the same place that once buried a mother's voice, the same room that had once applauded when Marcus was wrongly convicted. Then he spoke, slowly, clearly. "Justice is not something to be granted. It's something that must be reclaimed." The room froze. No one clapped, because they knew. What Elias had said wasn't just truth. It was an indictment of a system they'd helped keep silent. Elias stepped down from the podium without waiting for the tribute. He drove straight to Oakmere Cemetery, carrying a single wildflower, not as a tribute to the dead, but to lay beside the headstone of Aurora Bennett, the woman who fought in silence for 6 years, unheard, unbelieved. Beside him, Marcus stood with his head bowed, clutching Elias's old letter. Elias's voice dropped to a whisper. "If a forgotten child can still find the light, then we, the ones still breathing, must learn to walk for that light every single day." And then, as if closing a chapter, a soft breeze swept through the cemetery. There was nothing left to say, because sometimes truth doesn't need to be spoken. It only needs to be seen. At Oakmere Cemetery, the wind drifted gently through rows of gray headstones. No music, no cameras, just Marcus Delaney, dressed in a simple white shirt, standing quietly by his mother's grave. In his hands was a folded, time-worn piece of paper. The ink had faded, but the words Elias Whitaker had once written were still clear. "Your son has seen the light." No one spoke. The small crowd behind him remained silent, because they knew no speech could match this moment. A boy once imprisoned for the color of his skin, for a system that refused to listen, was now free. But his mother had paid the price, with her silence, forever. Marcus knelt, placing the letter beside a withering bouquet of white flowers. Then, as if speaking for all those who never got to say goodbye, he closed his eyes and whispered, "We don't reclaim justice for the living, but for those who never had the chance to be heard." The scene fades with a slow, wide shot, gliding past her headstone, then rising toward a sky stained with the soft hues of dusk. A breeze lifts the letter from the grave, swirling it gently around Marcus before it drifts down, landing at the feet of Elias, standing just a few steps away, silent, eyes red. Do you believe justice is real? If it takes 6 years and a mother's death to be seen? If you've ever believed in something worth fighting for, share your thoughts below. And if you believe the light deserves to be seen, subscribe so we can keep telling the stories no one wants to remember, but the world needs to hear. In a town that had all but forgotten the truth, the story of Elias Whitaker and Marcus Delaney wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fight to reclaim dignity in a system that had once denied it. Elias, a prosecutor who could have stayed silent, protected his career, kept his name untarnished, chose instead to face public disgrace, suspension, and isolation, all for a boy he had never met. Marcus, a young black teen wrongfully convicted, spent 6 years behind bars, not because he was guilty, but because no one looked beyond his skin color and his poverty. But what gives this story its weight is not the moment Marcus walked free. It's Elias kneeling at Aurora's grave, laying down a letter as a late apology, not just from one man, but from an entire system that failed her. This story reminds us, justice doesn't arrive on its own. It must be demanded, with courage, persistence, and compassion. None of us are too small to change something, but it takes bravery to stand on the side of what's right, especially when there's a price to pay. And maybe, what matters more than the law is remembering to hear the quietest voices, because sometimes they're the ones holding the key that leads us back to the light.